One of the most well-known games to have been released on a cassette tape for the 8-bit Atari computers was, by means of what I've gathered, was little less than brute force, English Software's Jet Boot Jack, released in 1983. What I mean by that is that English Software practically force-fed the game to Atari computer owners by featuring it on many of their compilation tapes after the initial standalone release. The English Software compilations aren't exactly rare either, but the force-feeding doesn't mean it's not a good game. Actually, it's a neat little arcade action title with interesting gameplay mechanics. Your mission is to collect all the musical note icons from each level while avoiding getting hit by anything. Since you're actually flying around on your jet boots, moving around the caverns is not nearly as simple as it looks, which is what really makes the game what it is. Highly addictive and good, different sort of fun from that time. I did make a comparison of this game not too long ago, but Jet Boot Jack has been one of those games that I feel like I've known it my whole life. Although I'll never be able to point out when, where, and on what platform I played it first. But through emulation, the Atari version is where I finally learned to play it some 20 years ago, and it's one of those games I keep returning to every now and then. Next up, we have a cult classic from Activision. If you've ever played Enduro on the Atari 2600 or ZX Spectrum, which I actually featured in episode 28, this game here, the Great American Cross Country Road Race, is actually an expanded version of Enduro, or perhaps a sequel depending on how you view it. This time the creator, Alex DeMeo, has taken further inspiration from one of my favorite racing movies of all time, the Gumball Rally, and get you drive a selectable route from various options within the United States of America. Much like its predecessor, Road Race features a day-to-night cycle, various road conditions and weather. Additionally, you also have to keep an eye on your fuel gauge and make filling stops every now and then, and you also need to keep out of trouble with the law, much like in Gumball Rally. Although playing through a single route in the Great American Cross Country Road Race can be a bit tiresome, you can also consider how tiresome would a similar race be for real, and how long would it take to drive even a racing car from Washington to Miami or whatever. All things considered, it really is an enjoyable game, and it broke some ground in its time. Highly recommended for any retro gaming enthusiast, and a must for all you scholars out there. Paul Wokes is a name that should be mentioned in at least one of these episodes because I haven't had the chance to do a proper memorial for him after his untimely demise in 2017, nor for his brother-in-arms, Bruce Jordan, the other man behind Novagen, who passed away in 2007. Although Novagen produced many classic 3D titles such as Backlash, Mercenary, and Democles, it's their first game, Encounter, which I shall always remember most fondly and return to at regular intervals. Originally published by Synapse Software, Encounter broke some good ground by being one of the first ever first-person shooters that were released on home computers, and it was a damn good one at that. Instead of detail and actual three-dimensional elements, the game relied on simple geometric two-dimensional figures in a three-dimensionally moving environment, which made the game superbly quick. With no real point to the game other than being a test of your skills in a high adrenaline environment, Encounter was really the original blueprint for the modern classics from a decade later, Wolfenstein 3D and Doom. Encounter was also released on the Commodore 64, Amiga, and Atari ST, but it's the 8-bit Atari where the story started from. An immensely important title in the history of first-person shooters, and still well worth having a go every now and then. Datasoft released a few brilliant, if a bit similarly styled, action-adventuring platformers within a few years, and my Nostalgia Trip Games has mentioned Bruce Lee from this group of games in episode number 8. Now it's time to feature another game from the group, the Goonies, released in 1985. This is a really unique sort of a puzzle platformer, since all you do is walk and jump around and switch between the two given characters for each level. The idea is to accomplish different tasks in each screen to get to the next one, and finally reach the I won't tell you the ending in case you haven't even seen the movie. Really fun stuff, and this was much more tuned into the movie structure than any of the other Goonies games on other platforms, particularly the Famicom one. However, the game itself doesn't really give you much of hints, so your only help would have been the fairly poetic hint sheet provided with an original copy of the game. Actually, although I got to play this game for the first time on my C64, I had heard of much intriguing things about it from my brother, who had played it on an Atari 800XL at a friend's. So, the majority of my Atari-based nostalgia comes from the memory of that time when I had only second-hand knowledge and hype of the game. But in hindsight, the Goonies, as well as most other Datasoft games, feel very much Atari games. We end this episode with another Synapse Software game, this time a rather odd Qbert variant called Rainbow Walker. Again, this was one of those titles that I hadn't even heard of until emulation came along, but has since been one of my favorite Atari games to return to occasionally. But just calling it a Qbert variant doesn't tell you enough really. You hop around in a three-dimensionally scrolling environment, which kind of looks more like Trailblazer, but the level scrolls back and forth and loops after a point. The idea is to make all slabs in the loop colored, much like in Qbert, and avoid getting hit by any of the flying menaces around the loop. There's also a hopping goblin that will erase the color from the slabs it hops into, but getting a row finished locks the colored slabs in that row, so your progress will not be completely impossible. One more thing about the environment is, when you compare it to Qbert again, is that the levels have a lot more variety because of how they're laid out. Looping roads instead of isometric pyramid-like things that don't really offer much of space to have variety. Well, to be fair, classics are classics for good reasons, but cult classics are, if not necessarily on the same level of classic, often much more interesting exactly because of it. Rainbow Walker is exactly like that, and I do much rather play it than Qbert, and nostalgia has only a very little to do with it.